What's going on, guys? It's Fight Season MMA, and today I want to talk about the UFC champions at the end of 2025, predicting who they are going to be after this year coming up. As we all know, Islam Makhachev defending his belt. All these guys are going to go defend their belt, but I want to see and I want to make my predictions going into this year and see who is going to hold the title at the end of the year in each division. Like I said, there's a lot of talented fighters and a lot of number one contenders, and I definitely think the belt is going to change hands in a lot of these divisions, but today we are going to make those final predictions. If you guys enjoy the UFC content, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe. That is the best way to help the channel grow. And while you're down there, please turn on the post notifications just so you guys are always notified when UFC content releases every single day. But without further ado, let's jump right into the video talking about predicting the UFC champions at the end of 2025. So, starting in the UFC flyweight division, I do think that Alexandre Pantoja is going to hold the belt. Let's give about a 70% chance that he is going to hold the belt inside this division. Now, really, where's that other 30% going? I'm going to say that about 20 of that is going to go to Deiveson Figueiredo, and 10 of that is going to go to Brandon Royval. You know, I see Pantoja's next matchup being either between Kai Kara France or being against Deiveson Figueiredo, and I do think it's going to be against Figueiredo because he is the greatest flyweight of all time, along guys like Henry Cejudo, Demetrius Johnson. I'm not saying he's number one because he's not number one, but he's up there for one of the flyweight goats. So I do think that Pantoja versus Figueiredo, the only guy to ever beat Pantoja, I believe inside the UFC, Deiveson Figueiredo going out back down to 125 to challenge for the UFC flyweight title. I do think that Pantoja is too well-rounded really to go in there and truly to lose to Figueiredo. I think he's going to absolutely go down and demolish Deiveson Figueiredo. I do think the weight cut is a lot for Figueiredo, especially going down to 145, but I do think that Figueiredo has that power. It's going to translate, and I do think that if he wants to win this fight, he's got to keep it standing. Now, 10% to Brandon Royval. I do think that Royval is the best UFC flyweight currently in the division, and that is negating Figueiredo and Pantoja. I do think that he is above Moreno, Kai Kara France, all these different type of guys. And I do think that, you know, if Royval gets this win over Manel Kape, he is undeniable for a rematch with Pantoja or a winner of whoever is currently the UFC flyweight title holder. But then genuinely, I think 70% is going to be Pantoja, 20% is going to be Figueiredo, and 10% is going to be Royval. Moving on forward with the UFC bantamweight division, I do think that the champion at the end of the year for the UFC bantamweight division is going to be Umar Nurmagomedov. He's the most well-rounded fighter inside the division. I do think that he is ultimately going to beat Merab Dvalishvili come January 18th, UFC Los Angeles, California at the Intuit Dome. I do think that that is going to be ultimately Umar's night to get the belt raised. You know, I also think that Umar is going to defend probably 2 times this year, and that next fight coming against Sean O'Malley. So I'm going to say that Umar Nurmagomedov is going to have a 50% shot of winning the belt by the end of the year. I'm going to say Merab has like a 40% shot and Sean O'Malley has a 10% shot. You know, I do think that it's a very close fight between Umar and Merab, but I do have Umar going out there and winning. And either one of those guys is going to go out there and smoke Sean O'Malley. You know, I look at O'Malley, he's kind of a one-dimensional fighter when it comes to the striking game. He does have improved takedown defense, something that he has desperately needed to improve on his entire career, but Merab was able to go out there and neutralize that, and especially when you kind of implement the striking game of Umar Nurmagomedov. I just truly don't see a way that Sean O'Malley is going to be able to go out there and combat that, especially since that Umar is maybe even a better technical grappler than Merab, whereas Merab has the kind of, you know, the strength and the Georgian, you know, kind of pressure and gas tank that no one else has inside the organization. But I do think that Umar is going to go in there and beat Merab. I do think it's a very close fight, but I do think the winner of January 18th is going to end the year as a UFC bantamweight champion. And the reason I give Sean O'Malley a 10% chance is because I do think he's going to fight for the title next. I don't know exactly when that is going to be, but I do think that the bantamweight title will be defended twice in 2025. Inside the UFC featherweight division, I'm going to say that the UFC featherweight champion is going to be Diego Lopez by the end of the year. Now, this is 100% accounting for Ilia Topuria leaving the division. I will 100% redact that statement because Ilia Topuria, no one's beating him at featherweight. He is 100% going to be the UFC featherweight champion by the end of the year. No ifs, ands, or buts. But if we remove Topuria from this, I'm going to say that it is going to be let's say 50% Diego Lopez, 30% Alexander Volkanovski, and I'm going to say 20% Movsar Evloev. You know, I really look at these guys and I see that Diego Lopez is such a good striker. Diego Lopez also has a great jiu-jitsu game, and his first fight ever inside the UFC was against Movsar Evloev at UFC 288, taken on 5 days' notice. Movsar 19-0. Undefeated fighter from Dagestan, and he is a great wrestler that not a lot of people know of, honestly. And truly, Diego Lopez had an absolute war with him, put him in a very deep leg lock, and a bunch of different other things going back at it. But I do think that Diego Lopez knocks out Alexander Volkanovski in the next UFC title fight, and Movsar Evloev is going to be the guy going in there and challenging for the belt right after that. Now, I do think that would be a co-main event. I don't think the UFC likes Movsar. He's not this big household name, but I do think if Diego Lopez knocks out Alexander Volkanovski, that fight with Movsar Evloev would be a lot bigger. But like I said, Volk always has a chance of winning. He's one of, if not the greatest featherweights of all time, and genuinely, Volkanovski can beat Diego Lopez, but the biggest question is that chin of his, and I don't know if he's going to be able to get past Lopez's power in round 1. Now, UFC lightweight division, I'm going to say it is Islam Makhachev. I do think that is the best person inside the featherweight division. I'm going to say 50% Islam. I am then going to say 30% Ilia Topuria and 15% for each of Charles do Bronx Oliveira and Arman Tsarukyan. I do think the lightweight title is going to be defended 3 times this year, and I do think that is a very bold statement, but I do think it's going to be, this event at UFC 311. Islam's going to defend possibly in June, and then also come back to event at Abu Dhabi. I do think that is going to be the 3 events that are going to be held this year for Islam Makhachev, and I do think he's going to go out there and win every single one of them. I do think that this first one is going to be against Arman Tsarukyan. I do think that Charles Oliveira could possibly be granted himself into a title shot, which I do think that, Islam would beat both Arman and Charles Oliveira, but you got to give them some sort of shot if they're going to get the title shot. But Ilia Topuria versus Islam Makhachev is easily the most interesting fight in UFC history, in my opinion. The 2 most technical fighters below lightweight, that being Ilia and Islam, going against one another, and truly shows who is the best fighter currently under 155. I do think the factor here that will separate these two is Islam's size. I do think that Islam would be able to go in there and kind of ragdoll Ilia. You looked at his fight with Jai Herbert, and he kind of got ragdolled by Herbert in some instances, even though Topuria got the finish. Ilia's got knockout power, but Islam's a dominant wrestler, great striker, and has an all-around game truly to go in there and beat up someone like Ilia Topuria. Now, like I said, Topuria is one of the best UFC featherweights in the world right now, and I do think that he has an opportunity to go out there and beat someone like Islam Makhachev. Like I said, I do think that Islam has a 50% to be champion. I do think Ilia's 30%. I do think he's going to be Islam's toughest challenge, and 10% to both Charles Oliveira and Arman Tsarukyan. Now, inside the UFC welterweight division, I do think the champion is going to still be Belal Muhammad. I do think the belt is going to get defended twice this year, possibly once in April or May, and then at the end of the year sometime in October, November territory. I do think that Belal Muhammad is going to go out there and ragdoll Shavkat. I looked at this fight with Ian Machado Gary, and Shavkat was truly he didn't look that great. He was supposed to go out there and dominate Gary, and he was not able to do that. Now, Ian Gary's stock 100% rose in that fight, and that was something that I was so happy to see, considering that Ian Gary is one of the most underrated fighters, or overlooked fighters, considering when you talk about all of his situations with his wife and all the media and the Colby Covington stuff. I truly do think that showed how good of a fighter Ian Gary is. But Shavkat Rakhmonov, I do think he's going to go out there and lose to Belal Muhammad. I probably would say Belal has a 60% chance of keeping it, and then I'm going to go with probably 20% to Shavkat, and let's say 20% to Sean Brady. I do think Sean Brady is going to go and fight Leon Edwards in his next one, and I do think that he is the current second best welterweight in the world. I think Sean Brady would beat someone like Shavkat Rakhmonov. I do think his striking or his grappling style would be a little bit to drown him, but I do see, considering that Belal and Sean Brady fought prior, I do see Belal Muhammad winning that fight yet again, considering that Sean Brady kind of got neutralized. His ground game got neutralized by Belal. but also he was absolutely murked in the stand-up, ultimately standing TKO'd by Bilal. And truly, I do see Bilal Muhammad keeping this belt ultimately to the end part of the year. The reason I do not have Islam as one of the possible contenders inside the welterweight division, as he has constantly said that if Bilal Muhammad is the champion, he will not fight up at welterweight. And at that, I'm kind of making the assumption that Islam won't move up to middleweight or welterweight if Bilal is the champion, because middleweight's too big of a jump, and he doesn't want to fight his teammate in Bilal. Now, inside the UFC middleweight division, I actually have it as a tie as the coming out of the champion next year. 35% Khamzat Chimaev, 35% Dricus du Plessis, and 30% for Sean Strickland. Now, first fight that is happening is Sean Strickland versus Dricus du Plessis, UFC 312 in Sydney, Australia. This fight is one of those fights that will always be close considering of Sean Strickland's style. There will be no instance where Dricus du Plessis won't have a hard time with Sean Strickland. He is such a good boxer. He kind of keeps that Philly shield up super high. And truly, Dricus du Plessis is going to have a very hard fight like he did in this first one, but I do think he would be able to eke out a victory. Now, like I said, that first fight was very close, and I'm going off of that. I would say that Dricus du Plessis has a slight shot to win, but I do think that ultimately Dricus du Plessis will go out there and beat Sean Strickland, but I do think Strickland could win as well. That leaves the bigger test of down the line. Khamzat Chimaev has guaranteed himself a title shot with that win against Robert Whittaker at UFC 308 in Abu Dhabi. I do think that this is one of the most interesting fights you truly look at. Everyone is saying that Khamzat Chimaev is the greatest middleweight in the division right now. I see Dricus du Plessis, and I can't bet against him. I tell everyone every single time that Dricus du Plessis will find a way to win. If he fights Khamzat, I'm picking Dricus. There's no way I'm ever going to bet against Dricus du Plessis because he might not look like he's the best fighter, but he makes all fighters fight his style. He made Robert Whittaker switch to Dricus's pace. He made Adesanya switch to Dricus's style. And every time you do that, Dricus is going to win the fight. The only person who went out there and kind of was able to keep their own was Sean Strickland, and that's why he did so well against Dricus du Plessis. I do think that Dricus would be able to survive round one against Khamzat and ultimately switch the later rounds into his favor, getting a later knockout. But like I said, Khamzat's such a dominant wrestler that I'm not 100% sure Dricus could 100% go out there and stop the takedowns in round 1 and 2. That's why I got it even at 35% for each Dricus and Khamzat, and giving Sean Strickland his respect at 30% inside the middleweight division. Now, UFC light heavyweight division, I'm going to say it's Alex Pereira. I don't think that's really a hot take or anything. I know he's going to fight Magomed Ankalaev next, and he's thought of to be Alex's toughest challenger, the wrestler and whatnot, but Magomed isn't really a wrestler. Not a lot of people understand that. Magomed's takedown accuracy is very low. Magomed doesn't shoot that many takedowns, and when he takes down your opponent, he really doesn't use it to go for submissions or ground and pound or anything like that. He's kind of just lays on them to get control time to ultimately win rounds. I do think that Alex Pereira knocks out Magomed Ankalaev when they fight, and I'm gonna ultimately say that Alex Pereira is gonna have a 60% chance to keep the belt. Magomed Ankalaev is going to have a 20% chance, and ultimately the other two fighters who I do think have a possibility is 10% to Yuri and 10% to Jamal Hill. I do think Jamal Hill is a better fighter than a lot of people think, even though he did get knocked out by Alex Pereira in the main event of UFC 300. I do think that was some awkward timing. There is some stuff to go in there to say about Jamal Hill, but to genuinely make it sound like he was absolutely, Dutched out of his title shot against Pereira is absolutely BS. I 100% do think that Jamal Hill is a very good fighter and a very, prominent figure inside that light heavyweight division, and I do think he can go out there and beat someone like Pereira. I just don't think it's very likely. And Yuri Prochazka, even though he's lost to Pereira twice, he's such an interesting fighter. He's such an interesting human being that I could 100% see him going in there and somehow beating Pereira. But like I said, I'm going to make it as a 10% for each of them. Ultimately, Pereira 60%, Ankalaev 20%, because he is Pereira's toughest challenge. Still, even though he's not the greatest wrestler and maybe doesn't have the greatest striking, he's still a very tough challenge. And Jamal and Yuri with 10% each. Now, inside the UFC heavyweight division, I'm going to say that the champion is going to be Tom Aspinall. I'm going to say 50% for Tom Aspinall, 45% for John Jones, and 5% for Cyril Gane. I do think that this belt is going to be defended twice this year, once at International Fight Week and once in December in Las Vegas. I do think that these are going to be some of the biggest fights in UFC history. I do think Cyril Gane loses the rematch to John Jones and Tom Aspinall. Kind of, either way you shake it, Gane is going to get absolutely destroyed, but you got to give him some thumb shot for getting the title shot. And I do think that Jon Jones will lose his first ever fight if you discredit the Matt Hamill loss, losing that undefeated shiny record to Tom Aspinall. You know, I think Aspinall is so dynamic. He's such a good fighter. He's so powerful. He's got such good footwork that genuinely I think Tom Aspinall would be able to go out there and outwork Jon Jones in different situations. I am so excited to see this fight happen, and genuinely I do think it's going to occur next year, probably at International Fight Weekend, one of the biggest pay-per-views of all time. Like I said, Jon Jones, the greatest UFC fighter of all time, skill for skill. He's not my GOAT, that's Georges St. Pierre. There's another video where I talked about that, but genuinely, skill for skill, I do think it's Jon Jones. Tom Aspinall, though, he's younger, he's hungrier, he is a proper heavyweight. Do think he's going to go out there and drop Jon Jones, finish him in the first 3 rounds of that 5-round war. Got to respect Jones. He's one of the greatest fighters of all time, as I've said. But genuinely, Tom Aspinall's a different breed, and I do think he's going to walk out of 2025 the undisputed UFC champion. Thank you guys so much for watching this episode of Fight Season MMA, and please let me know down below in the comment section what you think about these takes, about the champion in each respective division. Also, give me your guys' champion inside of each respective division. I would love to see what you guys are currently saying, because I do think that the UFC is at a very competitive point, especially since there are so many different divisions with so many different contenders who can truly pry the belt away from some of these champions. Like I said, I do think that Jon Jones is going to take his first L. I do think Islam Makhachev is going to establish himself as the greatest lightweight ever, and someone like Pantoja, who is incredibly overlooked, is going to retain his belt for the entirety of 2025. Well, thank you guys so much for watching this episode of Fight Season MMA. I know I kind of took a little bit of time off of YouTube, but that's just because that the UFC wasn't going on. I didn't want to make BS content or fake content about news that really wasn't happening, so I am back now. I'm going to be uploading every so often, not every single day because that's too challenging, but genuinely I'm so happy to be back on YouTube. Thank you guys so much for the support as always, and please let me know down below what other videos you want to see coming at you pretty much every day. Can guarantee probably about 3, 4, 5 videos a week if I had to say. But thank you guys so much for watching, for all the support, and I will catch you guys very soon when more UFC content and news.